Harold sat by the window of his old, creaky house, staring out at the overgrown garden. The house, much like its occupant, had seen better days. Paint peeled from the window frames, and the once vibrant flowers had long since withered. Harold's life had become a monotonous routine, punctuated by the occasional trip to the market for necessities. At 72, Harold's heart was as weathered as the house he lived in. The loss of his wife had hit him like a freight train, leaving him bitter and isolated. He had distanced himself from everyone, even his own family. The silence of his home was both a comfort and a reminder of his solitude. Each day blended into the next, marked only by the small chores he forced himself to do. He'd shuffle down the narrow, cluttered hallway to the kitchen, brew a pot of coffee, and sit in his favorite armchair, lost in thought. His days were empty, save for the occasional visit to the market, where he exchanged brief, polite words with the cashier before retreating back to his isolation. The market was a small, local store, filled with familiar faces he barely acknowledged. His interactions were minimal, just enough to get by. Harold would pick up his items, nod curtly at the cashier, and head back to his old, lonely house. The townsfolk knew him as the old man who kept to himself, a shadow of the vibrant person he once was. Life had become a series of monotonous loops, each one as dreary as the last. Harold's heart, heavy with unspoken grief, kept him prisoner in his own home, in his own mind. The world outside moved on, but for Harold, time seemed to stand still. Yet, even in his solitude, there was a lingering sense of something waiting to happen, a faint glimmer of change on the horizon. On a particularly dreary afternoon, Harold decided to visit the cemetery. It was a place he seldom went, as it held too many memories, too much pain. But something compelled him that day, an unspoken need to confront the past. He grabbed his worn coat, its pockets filled with remnants of old receipts and forgotten mementos, and stepped out into the crisp air. The cemetery was only a short walk away, nestled at the edge of the town. As Harold strolled down the familiar path, he noticed the subtle changes the years had brought. New gravestones dotted the landscape, mingling with the old, weathered ones. The trees, once saplings, now stood tall, casting long shadows over the ground. He approached his wife's grave with slow, deliberate steps, the weight of his grief pressing down on him. Her headstone was simple, just as she would have wanted, adorned with a few wilted flowers. Harold knelt down, tracing the engraved letters with a trembling hand. "Emily," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I've missed you every day." As he sat there, surrounded by the silent company of the departed, Harold reflected on the pain of his loss. The years had done little to heal the wound in his heart. Losing Emily had been like losing a part of himself, a part he could never reclaim. Her absence had created a void, one that he had tried to fill with bitterness and isolation. He thought about his family, those he had pushed away in his grief. His children, now grown, had their own lives, their own families. He had distanced himself from them, believing that his pain was a burden they should not bear. But in doing so, he had also deprived himself of the warmth and comfort they could have provided. Harold sighed deeply, the weight of his regrets pressing down on him. The cemetery was quiet, save for the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was a stark reminder of the inevitability of life and death, of the importance of cherishing those we hold dear. As he stood up to leave, Harold felt a faint glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a sense of clarity, a realization that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to seek out the connections he had lost. The importance of family, of love and companionship, was a lesson that Emily had tried to teach him, one that he had only fully understood in her absence. With a heavy heart but a newfound sense of purpose, Harold made his way back home, the echoes of his reflections lingering in his mind. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. A week later, on an unexpectedly sunny afternoon, Harold decided to take a rare stroll through the local park. The park had been one of Emily's favorite places, and though he usually avoided it, today he felt a strange urge to visit. The fresh air and the sounds of children playing in the distance provided a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of his home. As he walked along the winding paths, lost in thought, Harold noticed a small figure sitting alone on a bench. It was a young girl, no older than 7 or 8, with curly brown hair and a tear-streaked face. She was clutching a worn teddy bear, her eyes scanning the park with a mixture of fear and hope. Harold hesitated, his natural inclination to keep to himself warring with a newfound sense of empathy. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding with an unexpected urgency, and approached the bench cautiously. "Are you all right, young lady?" he asked gently, his voice softer than usual. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and relief. "I can't find my mommy," she said, her voice trembling. "I was playing, and then she was gone." Harold felt a pang of compassion. He remembered the panic and helplessness he had felt when he lost Emily, and though the situations were different, the emotion was painfully familiar. His instinct was to help, but he also felt the weight of his own isolation pressing down on him. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep his tone calm and reassuring. "Jennifer," she replied, clutching her teddy bear even tighter. "Well, Jennifer, my name is Harold. How about we try to find your parents together? Does that sound okay?" Jennifer nodded, a glimmer of hope returning to her eyes. Harold stood up, and together they began to walk through the park, calling out for her parents. As they wandered through the paths and playgrounds, Harold couldn't help but feel a strange sense of purpose. Helping Jennifer was a small act of kindness, but it felt significant, as if it were the beginning of something more. He had spent so long shutting out the world, and now, for the first time in years, he was reaching out, even if it was just to a frightened little girl. They walked for what felt like hours, searching every corner of the park. Despite their efforts, there was no sign of Jennifer's mother. Harold could see the worry growing in her eyes, and he knew they needed a new plan. Harold hesitated, his mind racing with the implications of what he was about to suggest. "Maybe we should go to the park office," he said finally, pointing to a small building near the entrance. "They can make an announcement, and we can wait there. How does that sound?" Jennifer looked up at him, her eyes filled with trust. "Okay," she agreed, her voice small but steady. As they made their way to the park office, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than just a random event. It felt like a turning point, a moment that might lead him back to the connections he had long since abandoned. Harold and Jennifer arrived at the park office, a small, unassuming building with a faded sign and a few scattered benches outside. Inside, a friendly attendant greeted them and immediately sprang into action, making an announcement over the park's loudspeaker system. As they waited, Harold found himself deep in thought. He watched Jennifer sitting quietly, her teddy bear still clutched tightly to her chest, and he felt a swell of emotions he hadn't experienced in years. The protective instinct he felt was almost overwhelming, yet he was plagued by doubts. Should he, a man who had isolated himself from the world, really involve himself in the troubles of this lost child? His mind drifted back to the years after Emily's death. The grief had been all-consuming, driving a wedge between him and everyone he loved. He had shut himself off, convinced that solitude was his only solace. Now, this little girl was stirring emotions he had buried long ago, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. As he sat on the bench outside the park office, Harold weighed his options. The rational part of his mind told him that once Jennifer's mother was found, he could simply walk away, return to his quiet, uneventful life. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant for too long, whispered that this was an opportunity for redemption, a chance to reconnect with the world. He watched Jennifer as she stared at the door, hopeful that her parents would walk through at any moment. Her innocence and vulnerability struck a chord in him, reminding him of his own children when they were young. He had been a different man then, loving and attentive. Could he find a way back to that person? Harold sighed deeply, the internal debate raging on. He knew helping Jennifer went against everything he had believed since his loss. It was a risk, opening himself up to potential hurt and disappointment. But there was also the potential for healing, for finding a purpose beyond his grief. "Harold," Jennifer's small voice broke through his thoughts. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with trust. "Do you think my mommy will come soon?" He managed a reassuring smile, though his heart was heavy with uncertainty. I'm sure she will, Jennifer. We just need to give her a little more time. They sat together in silence, the minutes ticking by slowly. As the hours passed with no sign of Jennifer's mother, Harold's concern grew. The park attendant made another announcement, but still, no one came. Harold felt a growing sense of responsibility for Jennifer, a desire to protect her and ensure she was safe. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in so long. It was almost foreign. As the day turned to evening, the park office began to close. The attendant approached Harold with a sympathetic expression. "We've done all we can for now," she said gently. "Perhaps you should take her to the police station. They might have more resources to help find her family." Harold nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. He looked at Jennifer, who was now clinging to her teddy bear, looking small and vulnerable. The thought of abandoning her to strangers was unbearable. "Come on, Jennifer," he said softly. "Let's go to the police station. They'll help us find your mother." Jennifer looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes and nodded. As they walked out of the park office, Harold's mind raced. He had intended to keep to himself, to live out his days in solitude. But now, with Jennifer by his side, he knew he couldn't walk away. The road ahead was uncertain, but Harold felt a spark of determination he hadn't felt in years. He would help this little girl, no matter what it took. As Harold and Jennifer walked to the police station, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town. Harold's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He had spent years avoiding attachments, yet here he was, feeling responsible for this little girl who had entered his life so unexpectedly. The police station was a modest building, its brick facade illuminated by a single streetlight. Inside, an officer at the front desk greeted them with a professional yet kind demeanor. Harold explained the situation, and the officer nodded, taking notes. "We'll do everything we can to find her mother," the officer assured them. "In the meantime, we need to get some information from her." Jennifer clung to Harold, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Harold knelt down beside her, giving her a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Jennifer. They just need to ask you a few questions to help find your mommy." Jennifer nodded bravely and followed the officer to a small room where they could talk. Harold watched her go, feeling a strange mix of protectiveness and helplessness. He sat in the waiting area, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, the officer returned with Jennifer, who looked even more fragile and lost than before. "We couldn't find any immediate information about her parents," the officer said. "We'll keep looking, but it might take some time. In the meantime, we need to find a temporary place for her to stay." Harold felt a surge of anxiety. He couldn't bear the thought of Jennifer being placed in a foster home, surrounded by strangers. He looked at the officer, a sense of resolve forming within him. "She can stay with me," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? It's a big responsibility." Harold nodded. "I may be an old man, but I can take care of her until we find her parents." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "All right. We'll need to do a quick background check and make sure everything's in order." After what felt like an eternity, the officer returned with the approval. "You're cleared to take her home," he said, handing Harold a packet of information. "Here's everything you'll need. If you have any questions or need anything, don't hesitate to call us." Harold thanked the officer and took Jennifer's hand. As they walked out of the police station, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. The walk back to Harold's house was quiet. Jennifer, exhausted from the day's events, clung to her teddy bear and stayed close to Harold. When they finally arrived, Harold realized just how unprepared he was for this new responsibility. His home, filled with relics of the past, was not exactly child-friendly. "Welcome to my home," he said, opening the door and leading her inside. "It's not much, but we'll make do." Jennifer looked around with wide eyes, taking in the dusty furniture and the faded photographs on the walls. "Thank you, Mr. Harold," she said softly. Harold's heart softened at her words. "You're welcome, Jennifer. We'll figure this out together." That night, Harold set up a makeshift bed for Jennifer in the guest room. As he tucked her in, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. "Good night, Jennifer," he said, turning off the light. "Good night, Mr. Harold," she replied, her voice small and sleepy. As Harold lay in his own bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized that this unexpected turn of events might be exactly what he needed. Helping Jennifer find her family was now his mission, but in doing so, he might also find a way back to his own. The days that followed were filled with a sense of unfamiliarity and cautious optimism. Harold found himself adjusting to a new routine, one that included caring for Jennifer. Mornings began with preparing breakfast, a task he hadn't done for anyone but himself in years. Jennifer, with her bright eyes and endless curiosity, brought a new energy to the old house. "Mr. Harold, why do you have so many books?" Jennifer asked one morning, her small hands tracing the spines of the many volumes lining the shelves. Harold smiled, a faint warmth spreading through his chest. "I've always loved to read. Books are like friends that never leave you." Jennifer nodded, seeming to understand. "Can you read me a story tonight?" "Of course," Harold replied, feeling a twinge of something he hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. Their days were a mix of small tasks and moments of connection. Harold took Jennifer to the market, where she marveled at the array of fruits and vegetables. He introduced her to the cashier, Mrs. Jenkins, who was surprised but pleased to see Harold with a child. "Who's this little darling?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, leaning over the counter with a smile. "This is Jennifer," Harold replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "She's staying with me for a while." Jennifer beamed, and Mrs. Jenkins winked at Harold. "Well, it's nice to see you out and about with some company, Harold." In the afternoons, Harold and Jennifer would walk through the park, their conversations ranging from her favorite cartoons to Harold's memories of the town when he was young. These walks became a cherished routine, a time for Harold to reflect and for Jennifer to feel safe and loved. One day, while tidying up the guest room, Harold came across an old photo album. The leather cover was worn, and the pages inside held memories of a life that seemed distant and almost forgotten. He sat down, flipping through the photographs, each one tugging at his heart. Jennifer walked in, her eyes lighting up when she saw the album. "Who are these people, Mr. Harold?" "That's my family," Harold said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "This is Emily, my wife, and these are our children when they were about your age." Jennifer climbed onto the chair next to him, peering at the photos. "They look so happy." "We were," Harold said softly, feeling a lump in his throat. "We were very happy." As they continued looking through the album, Harold shared stories of his children, their adventures, and the love that had once filled their home. Jennifer listened intently, her presence a comforting reminder that life, even after immense loss, could still hold moments of joy. One evening, as Harold read Jennifer a bedtime story, he felt a shift in his heart. The walls he had built around himself were beginning to crumble, piece by piece, with each shared moment and every innocent question from Jennifer. He found himself caring deeply for her, not just out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. Jennifer's laughter and curiosity breathed new life into Harold's days. The house, once filled with silence and shadows, now echoed with the sounds of her playing and their conversations. Harold began to feel something he thought he had lost forever: hope. As they continued their search for Jennifer's family, Harold couldn't help but notice how much she had become a part of his life. The bond they were forming was undeniable, and it made him wonder if perhaps this little girl was meant to be more than just a temporary guest in his home. The following weeks were filled with activities that slowly but surely chipped away at the walls Harold had built around his heart. The search for Jennifer's family continued, but they found joy in the simple pleasures of life. One Saturday morning, Harold took Jennifer to the town fair. It was an event he had avoided for years, but today, the prospect of seeing Jennifer's face light up with excitement was enough to propel him out of his comfort zone. The fairgrounds were a riot of color and sound. Brightly colored tints lined the perimeter, and the air was filled with the delicious aroma of popcorn and cotton candy. Harold bought tickets for the rides, and they spent the morning going from one attraction to another. Jennifer's laughter was infectious, and for the first time in years, Harold found himself genuinely enjoying the moment. "Look, Mr. Harold, a carousel?" Jennifer exclaimed, tugging at his sleeve. They made their way to the carousel, and Harold helped Jennifer onto one of the painted horses. As the carousel began to turn, Harold watched her face light up with pure delight, and he felt a warmth in his heart that he had almost forgotten existed. After the carousel, they wandered through the fair, playing games and winning small prizes. Jennifer was particularly taken with a stuffed bunny she won at a ring toss booth, and she hugged it tightly, a wide grin on her face. "Thank you, Mr. Harold," she said, looking up at him with shining eyes. "This is the best day ever." Harold smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment. "You're welcome, Jennifer. I'm glad you're having fun." In the afternoon, they visited a fortune-teller's tent. The fortune-teller, a kind-looking woman with twinkling eyes, took Jennifer's hand first. "You have a bright future ahead of you, my dear," she said with a smile. "You are surrounded by love and protection." Jennifer beamed at Harold, and the fortune-teller turned to him. She studied his palm for a moment, then looked into his eyes with a knowing expression. "You've carried a heavy burden for many years," she said softly, "but your heart is healing. This little one has brought light back into your life." As they left the tent, Harold felt a sense of peace wash over him. The fair had been a reminder of the joys of life, and Jennifer's presence had rekindled a part of him that he thought was lost forever. In the days that followed, Harold and Jennifer continued to explore the town together. They visited the local library, took long walks in the park, and shared stories. Each activity, no matter how small, was a step toward healing for Harold and a source of happiness for Jennifer. Their bond grew stronger with each adventure, and Harold began to see Jennifer not just as a temporary guest, but as a vital part of his life. The search for her family continued, but in the meantime, they had found a family in each other. One evening, while Harold and Jennifer were sorting through old boxes in the attic, they stumbled upon a dusty, forgotten photo album. Jennifer's eyes lit up with curiosity as she opened it, revealing a collection of faded photographs. "Who's this, Mr. Harold?" she asked, pointing to a picture of a young couple holding a baby. Harold squinted at the photo, his breath catching in his throat. "That's me and Emily and our son, Michael," he said softly, a wave of nostalgia washing over him. Jennifer turned the pages slowly, fascinated by the images of Harold's past. As they neared the end of the album, a loose photograph slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Harold picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. It was a picture of Michael as a teenager, standing next to a young woman Harold didn't recognize. "Who's that?" Jennifer asked, peering at the photo. Harold examined the picture closely, a sense of unease settling over him. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I've never seen this photo before." Jennifer looked at the woman in the photo, her brow furrowing. "She looks a lot like my mommy," she said softly, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph. Curiosity gnawed at Harold. That night, he lay awake, the mystery of the photograph swirling in his mind. The next morning, he made a few phone calls, determined to uncover the identity of the woman in the photo. He contacted old friends and family members, anyone who might have known Michael during those years. After several frustrating conversations, he finally reached someone who remembered the woman in the photo. Her name was Sarah, the old friend recalled. "She and Michael were very close for a while. I think she moved away, but I don't know where." Harold felt a surge of curiosity mixed with anxiety. Who was Sarah, and why had she been close to Michael? He knew he needed to find out more. Days turned into weeks as Harold and Jennifer continued their routine, but the mystery of Sarah lingered in Harold's mind. One afternoon, Harold decided to visit the town archives. It was a long shot, but he hoped to find some clue about Sarah and her connection to Michael. The archive was a quiet place, filled with rows of dusty files and old newspapers. Harold spent hours combing through records, piecing together fragments of the past. Finally, he stumbled upon a newspaper article that caught his eye. It was dated over 20 years ago, and it mentioned Michael and Sarah attending a local event together. The article didn't provide much information, but it was enough to give Harold a new lead. He followed the trail, uncovering small details about Sarah's life. She had moved out of town shortly after the article was published, and there were no further records of her in the town's archives. Harold's determination grew. He reached out to people who might have known Sarah, slowly piecing together her story. He learned that she had a daughter named Jennifer, and that they had lived in various places before finally settling in their current town. One evening, Harold sat down with Jennifer, his heart pounding with anticipation. "Jennifer, I need to show you something," he said gently, pulling out the old photograph of Michael and Sarah. Jennifer looked at the photo, her eyes widening with recognition. "That's my mommy," she exclaimed, pointing at Sarah. Harold's heart raced. "Do you remember anything else about her?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Jennifer nodded. "She used to tell me stories about a man named Michael. She said he was very special to her." Harold felt a surge of emotion. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. He realized that Michael and Sarah had been more than just friends. They had been deeply connected. Jennifer was the link between them, the key to understanding the past. With this new information, Harold felt a profound sense of purpose. He had uncovered a part of his family's history that had been hidden for years, and in doing so, he had found a connection to Jennifer that went beyond their current situation. She was not just a temporary guest in his home. She was family. As they sat together, Harold felt a renewed sense of hope. The journey ahead would be challenging, but he was determined to uncover the full story and build a future with Jennifer. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, ready to face whatever came next. With the revelation that Jennifer was indeed his granddaughter, Harold felt a mixture of elation and anxiety. This newfound connection was both a blessing and a challenge, and he was determined to uncover the full story of her past. However, as the days passed, the weight of his unresolved grief and the complexities of the situation began to take their toll. Harold decided to delve deeper into Sarah's life, hoping to find more clues about her and Michael's relationship and why Jennifer had been left alone. He contacted more people, chased down leads, and visited places that might hold answers. Each step forward seemed to reveal another layer of the mystery, but it also raised more questions. One afternoon, Harold received a call from an old friend who had known Michael and Sarah during their youth. The friend mentioned a significant argument between Michael and Sarah shortly before she disappeared from town. This revelation hit Harold hard, leaving him with more doubts and fears about the past. Maybe Sarah didn't want to be found, Harold thought, the possibility gnawing at him. What if Michael did something that drove her away? What if she left Jennifer because of him? The uncertainty began to wear on Harold. He started to second-guess every decision he made, every step he took in uncovering the past. The more he dug, the more he feared what he might find. The weight of these thoughts pressed heavily on him, casting a shadow over the moments of joy he shared with Jennifer. One evening, as he sat in his dimly lit living room, Harold felt an overwhelming sense of despair. The room seemed to close in on him, and the memories of Emily, Michael, and now Sarah and Jennifer swirled in a confusing, painful haze. He questioned his ability to care for Jennifer, fearing that the truth might bring more pain than resolution. Jennifer sensed his turmoil. "Mr. Harold, are you okay?" she asked, her small voice filled with concern. Harold forced a smile, but his eyes betrayed his worry. "I'm fine, Jennifer. Just a bit tired." Jennifer climbed onto the couch beside him, her presence a comforting reminder of the love they had found in each other. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "We're a team, remember?" Her words touched Harold deeply. Despite his fears, he knew that Jennifer was right. They had faced so much together already, and they could continue to face whatever came next. But the road ahead seemed more daunting than ever, filled with the potential for both healing and heartache. The next day, Harold decided to visit an old family friend who had been close to Michael. He hoped to find more answers, even though the prospect of uncovering painful truths loomed large. The friend welcomed him warmly, and they spent hours reminiscing about the past. Harold learned more about Michael's struggles and Sarah's fears, painting a picture of a complicated, love-filled, but troubled relationship. As Harold left the friend's house, he felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. He had gained some clarity, but it came at the cost of understanding the depth of the pain his son had endured. The weight of this new knowledge pressed heavily on him, and he feared what it might mean for Jennifer's future. Returning home, Harold found Jennifer playing with her teddy bear in the living room. She looked up and smiled, her innocence a stark contrast to the turmoil in Harold's heart. He sat down beside her, pulling her into a gentle hug. "We'll get through this, Jennifer," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "We'll find the answers we need." As they sat together, Harold realized that despite the darkness of the past, there was light in their present and hope for their future. The journey was far from over, but with Jennifer by his side, he felt a renewed determination to face whatever lay ahead. The revelations about Michael and Sarah had left Harold emotionally drained, but he knew that giving up was not an option. He had to keep pushing forward, for both his sake and Jennifer's. As days turned into weeks, Harold found himself revisiting places from his past, searching for any remaining threads that might lead to a complete picture. One rainy afternoon, Harold decided to visit the old family home where Michael had spent his childhood. The house had been sold years ago, but Harold hoped that being there might trigger some memory or insight. As he walked through the familiar rooms, he felt a rush of emotions, memories flooding back in vivid detail. He wandered into Michael's old bedroom, now bare and empty. As he stood there, he could almost hear the echoes of laughter, the sound of his son playing with toys, the quiet moments of bedtime stories. The weight of his grief pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. Harold sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and closed his eyes. The guilt of not being able to protect his son, of not being there when Michael needed him most, was overwhelming. He had isolated himself to avoid this pain, but now it was unavoidable. He had to face it head-on. Meanwhile, Jennifer sensed Harold's growing distress. She tried her best to keep his spirits up, but she could see the strain in his eyes. One evening, as they were having dinner, Jennifer looked at Harold with concern. "Mr. Harold, are you still thinking about my mommy and Michael?" she asked gently. Harold nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I am, Jennifer. It's just so much to take in." Jennifer reached out and held his hand, her small fingers squeezing his. "We'll find her together. I believe in us." Her words gave Harold a small but much-needed boost of courage. He knew he had to keep going, for her sake as well as his own. He decided to visit Sarah's old apartment, hoping to find something that could explain why she had left and where she might have gone. The apartment building was run down, its hallways dimly lit and echoing with distant sounds. Harold felt a sense of foreboding as he knocked on the door of Sarah's old neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, a woman who had lived there for decades. Mrs. Thompson opened the door, her face lighting up with recognition. "Harold, it's been years. What brings you here?" Harold explained his situation, his voice tinged with desperation. Mrs. Thompson invited him in and poured them both a cup of tea. She spoke warmly of Sarah, describing her as a kind but troubled young woman. "Sarah was always so worried about something," Mrs. Thompson recalled. "She loved Michael dearly, but there was always this sadness in her eyes. She never told me why she left, but I always had a feeling it was to protect Jennifer." Harold's heart ached with the weight of her words. He thanked Mrs. Thompson and left the apartment with more questions than answers. He felt like he was chasing shadows, the truth always just out of reach. Back at home, Harold found solace in Jennifer's presence. Despite his doubts and fears, he realized that she was his anchor, the reason he kept pushing forward. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Jennifer turned to him with a determined look. "Mr. Harold, we can't give up. My mommy wouldn't want us to." Harold nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "You're right, Jennifer. We won't give up." They continued their search, reaching out to anyone who might have known Sarah or Michael. The process was slow and often discouraging, but each small piece of information brought them closer to the truth. Harold knew that he had to confront his own past to find the answers they needed. He revisited old friends, reconnected with family members, and dug deep into memories he had long tried to forget. It was a painful journey, but with Jennifer by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope. As they pieced together the fragments of their family's history, Harold began to see a path forward. It was filled with uncertainty and challenges, but it was a path that promised healing and connection. For the first time in years, he felt that they were not just looking for answers, but building a future together. Harold and Jennifer's relentless search for answers led them to a small town several miles away, where an old friend of Michael's was said to reside. This friend, Tony, had known Michael during the final years of his life and might hold the key to understanding what had happened to Sarah. The drive to the town was long and filled with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Jennifer sat quietly in the back seat, clutching her teddy bear, while Harold navigated the winding roads. The landscape blurred past them, each mile bringing them closer to the truth they had been seeking for so long. When they arrived, they found Tony living in a modest house on the outskirts of town. He welcomed them warmly, though his eyes held a shadow of sadness when Harold mentioned Michael. Tony led them into his living room, and they sat down, the air thick with unspoken questions. Harold took a deep breath, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Tony, we need to know what happened to Sarah and Michael. Jennifer deserves to know the truth." Tony nodded, his gaze turning distant as he recalled the past. Michael and Sarah were deeply in love, but their relationship was complicated. Michael struggled with many things, and Sarah tried to help him, but it wasn't easy. He paused, looking at Jennifer with a soft smile. "Sarah loved you very much, Jennifer. She always talked about wanting to keep you safe." Harold felt a lump in his throat as Tony's words sank in. "Do you know where Sarah went?" he asked softly. Tony shook his head. "She mentioned heading to a shelter for women and children, a place where she thought they would be safe. I tried to find her after that, but I had no luck." The room fell silent as the weight of Tony's story settled over them. Harold felt a mixture of sorrow and relief. They were closer to understanding what had happened, but the full truth still eluded them. "There's one more thing," Tony said, breaking the silence. "Before Sarah left, she gave me this." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. "She told me to keep it safe and only give it to you if you ever came looking for her." Harold took the notebook, his hands trembling. He opened it slowly, revealing pages filled with Sarah's handwriting. The entries detailed her love for Michael, her fears, and her determination to protect Jennifer at all costs. Each word painted a picture of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her child's safety. Tears streamed down Harold's face as he read, and Jennifer hugged him tightly, sensing the gravity of the moment. "We have to find her, Mr. Harold," she whispered. "We have to find my mommy." Harold nodded, his resolve stronger than ever. "We will, Jennifer. We'll find her." With Tony's information and Sarah's notebook as their guide, Harold and Jennifer set out on a new journey, this time with a clearer sense of purpose. They visited shelters and reached out to organizations that might have records of Sarah and Jennifer's stay. Finally, after weeks of searching, they received a promising lead from a shelter in a nearby city. The shelter director confirmed that Sarah and Jennifer had stayed there several years ago but had moved on to another facility. Following the trail, Harold and Jennifer arrived at the new location, their hearts pounding with anticipation. As they walked through the doors, they were greeted by a kind woman who led them to a small, sunlit room. There, sitting quietly by the window, was Sarah. Jennifer ran to her, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Mommy!" Sarah turned, her eyes widening with disbelief and overwhelming relief. "Jennifer!" she cried, embracing her daughter tightly. Harold stood back, his heart swelling with emotion. The reunion he had worked so hard for was finally happening before his eyes. Sarah looked up, meeting Harold's gaze with gratitude and recognition. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for bringing her back to me." Harold nodded, tears blurring his vision. "We're family," he said simply, "and family takes care of each other." As the sun set outside, casting a warm glow over the room, Harold felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led them to this moment of healing and reunion. Together, they would face whatever came next, bound by the strength of their love and the power of their newfound family. The days following the reunion were filled with emotional highs and quiet moments of reflection. Sarah and Jennifer spent hours catching up, sharing stories, and rebuilding their bond. Harold watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride and relief. The pain of the past was beginning to heal, replaced by a sense of hope for the future. Harold's home, once a place of solitude and sorrow, now echoed with laughter and conversation. Sarah moved in with Jennifer, and together they transformed the house into a warm and welcoming space. They filled the rooms with new memories, each day bringing a new reason to smile. One evening, after dinner, Harold and Sarah sat down for a serious conversation. Harold needed to understand why Jennifer had been abandoned in the park that day. It was a question that had haunted him since their first encounter. "Sarah, can you tell me what happened?" Harold asked gently. "Why was Jennifer alone in the park?" Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes welling with tears. "It wasn't supposed to be that way, Harold. I never intended to leave her. I was in a difficult situation, and I thought I was doing what was best for her." Harold listened intently, his heart aching for the pain Sarah had endured. "After Michael passed away, I struggled to cope," Sarah began. "I fell into a bad relationship with a man named Tom. He was abusive, controlling, and dangerous. I tried to leave him, but he threatened to hurt Jennifer if I did." Sarah's voice broke, and Harold reached out to hold her hand, offering silent support. "One day, things got really bad," Sarah continued. "Tom became violent, and I knew I had to get Jennifer out of there. I told her we were going to the park to play, but my real plan was to find a safe place to leave her where she would be found and taken care of. I hoped someone would find her and keep her safe until I could come back for her." Harold's heart tightened at the thought of the terror Sarah and Jennifer had experienced. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" he asked softly. "I tried," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "But Tom found out what I was doing, and he kept me captive for days. I was desperate to escape, but by the time I finally got free, Jennifer was gone. I searched for her everywhere, contacted the police, and checked shelters, but I couldn't find her." Harold's mind flashed back to the day he found Jennifer in the park, lost and alone. He realized now the depth of Sarah's sacrifice and the danger she had faced. "Sarah, you did what you had to do to protect her," Harold said gently. "And now we're here, together. We found each other again." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm just so grateful that you found her, Harold. I don't know what I would have done if anything had happened to her." Jennifer, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, ran to her mother and hugged her tightly. "Mommy, I'm so glad we're together again," she said, her voice muffled against Sarah's shoulder. Harold felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him. They had uncovered the truth, and now they could begin to heal and move forward together. The journey had been long and painful, but it had brought them to this moment of reconciliation and hope. In the days that followed, Harold, Sarah, and Jennifer settled into a new routine, filled with love and support. Harold found joy in simple activities like reading to Jennifer, cooking meals with Sarah, and taking walks together. The house, once a symbol of loneliness, was now filled with warmth and laughter. One sunny afternoon, Harold took Sarah and Jennifer to the park. As they walked along the familiar paths, Harold reflected on how far they had come. The park, once a place of sorrow, was now a symbol of their resilience and strength. "Mr. Harold, can we go on the carousel?" Jennifer asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Harold smiled warmly. "Of course, Jennifer. Let's go." They made their way to the carousel, and Harold helped Jennifer onto one of the painted horses. As the carousel began to turn, he stood back, watching her laugh and wave. Sarah joined him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough, Harold," she said softly. "For everything." Harold shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to thank me, Sarah. We're family, and family sticks together." Sarah nodded, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. "Yes, we are." As the carousel continued to spin, Harold felt a profound sense of contentment. The pain and regret that had weighed him down for so long were finally lifting, replaced by the love and connection he had rediscovered. He knew that the road ahead would have its challenges, but with Sarah and Jennifer by his side, he was ready to face anything. That evening, they returned home and settled into their cozy living room. Harold picked up a book and began to read aloud, his voice steady and comforting. Jennifer snuggled up next to him, her head resting on his shoulder, while Sarah sat nearby, listening with a peaceful smile. As the story unfolded, Harold realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. A sense of belonging, a family to love and protect, and the chance to create new memories together. The darkness of his past had given way to a bright and hopeful future. "Good night, Jennifer," Harold said, closing the book and tucking her in. "Good night, Grandpa," Jennifer replied, her eyes closing with a contented sigh. Harold's heart swelled at the word Grandpa. It was a title he wore with pride, a symbol of the new life they had built together. As he turned off the light and made his way to his own room, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had led him to this moment of redemption and renewal. He had found his way back to the family he had lost, and in doing so, he had discovered a part of himself he thought was gone forever. As sleep claimed him, Harold knew that tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new reasons to cherish the life they had built together. The future was bright, and for the first time in years, he looked forward to each new day with a heart full of hope and love.